"You'll leave this cemetery with nothing but your grief," my husband's mistress whispered with a satisfied smile as guests were still placing flowers beside his casket. I looked into her eyes, said nothing, and simply folded my hands in front of me. She mistook my silence for defeat. Everyone else did too. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and at 68 years old, I had buried the man I had loved for 43 years. The morning sky above the cemetery was gray, the kind that seemed unable to decide whether to rain or simply hang heavy over everyone gathered below. Friends, neighbors, business partners, and distant relatives stood in quiet circles speaking in lowered voices, sharing stories about Charles Brooks, the respected contractor who had spent decades building homes throughout our county. I should have been focused on saying goodbye to my husband. Instead, I found myself watching another woman stand beside the casket as though she belonged there more than I did. Vanessa Carter wore a tailored black dress that looked more suited for a luxury luncheon than a funeral. She accepted condolences with graceful smiles, nodded politely at people who barely knew her, and somehow managed to place herself at the center of every conversation. A few months earlier, most of these people had never even heard her name. Now they acted as if she had always been part of Charles's life. I could feel curious eyes drifting toward me every few minutes, waiting to see how the widow would react. I refused to give them a scene. Charles had always hated public arguments. Even now, I wanted to honor that part of him, though I no longer knew how much of the man I had loved still existed during his final months. As the minister concluded the service, people slowly stepped forward to offer their condolences. Some hugged me. Others simply squeezed my hand. Their kindness helped, but it was overshadowed by the quiet confidence radiating from Vanessa. She moved through the crowd like someone who already believed the future belonged to her. Then, as the final prayer ended and people began walking toward their cars, she approached me. She glanced at the wedding ring I still wore before allowing herself a small smile that never reached her eyes. "You're broke now," she said softly enough that only I could hear. Charles made sure of that. "I hope you're ready to start over." For just a heartbeat, the words settled over me like cold winter air. I thought about every anniversary, every family dinner, every promise Charles and I had shared over 4 decades. I thought about the nights I sat beside his hospital bed, reading to him while machines quietly hummed in the background. I thought about how easily another person could reduce an entire lifetime to one cruel sentence. Still, I refused to answer. Instead, I looked past Vanessa toward the polished oak casket surrounded by white lilies. "Goodbye, Charles," I whispered inside my heart. "I hope somewhere beneath all the mistakes, you remembered who stood beside you first." Vanessa gave a quiet laugh, clearly disappointed that she had failed to provoke me. She turned toward a group of Charles's former colleagues, already speaking as though she represented his legacy. A few minutes later, as nearly everyone reached their vehicles, a calm voice rose behind us. "Ladies and gentlemen," Attorney Richard Bennett called out, holding a leather portfolio against his chest. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise it. Mr. Brooks left specific instructions. He requested that his immediate family, designated beneficiaries, and certain named individuals remain together for the formal reading of his estate documents immediately following today's service. Vanessa's smile widened with unmistakable confidence. She adjusted the sleeve of her coat and looked directly at me one more time, certain that the next hour would erase whatever place I still believed I held in Charles Brooks's life. I simply nodded, took one slow breath, and followed the others toward the waiting cars, unaware that the first document Richard Bennett would place on the conference table was not the one anyone expected. Richard Bennett drove alone, and I followed behind him through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar even though I had lived in this town for more than 40 years. Every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual. Every storefront carried memories of Charles and me. There was the bakery where he used to buy cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning, insisting they tasted better if we ate them before reaching home. There was the hardware store where he could spend an hour talking about lumber and paint colors with complete strangers. I wondered when those ordinary moments had quietly disappeared, replaced by hospital visits, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and long evenings when he claimed he was too tired to talk. 3 days before Charles passed away, I arrived at the hospital just after sunrise carrying a small thermos of homemade chicken soup. His favorite blue sweater was folded neatly over the visitor's chair because he always complained the room felt too cold. When I reached his door, I noticed Vanessa already inside. She stood beside his bed reviewing documents on a tablet while speaking in a calm, practiced voice. The moment she saw me, she smiled politely, but there was something rehearsed about it. "Charles has had a difficult morning," she said before I could even greet him. "The doctor recommended he limit visitors for a while." I looked toward my husband. His eyes met mine for only a second before drifting away. He looked exhausted, thinner than I had ever seen him, but there was also something else in his expression. Regret, confusion, perhaps even frustration. I stepped closer anyway and placed the thermos on the bedside table. "I will only stay a minute," I said softly. Charles slowly reached for my hand. His grip was weaker than it had ever been, yet he squeezed my fingers with surprising determination. His lips moved before any sound came out. Finally, he whispered, "Richard knows." I leaned closer, believing he wanted to tell me something important. "What does Richard know?" I asked gently. Before he could answer, Vanessa stepped between us with careful professionalism. "He needs to rest," she said. "The medication makes long conversations difficult." Charles closed his eyes, and the opportunity vanished. As I walked toward the hallway, I turned back once more. My husband had opened his eyes again. He was watching me leave, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt as though he wanted to explain something, but no longer knew how. During the following days, I replayed those two words in my mind again and again. Richard knows. Richard Bennett had served as our attorney for more than 25 years. He handled the paperwork when we refinanced our first home, established our retirement plans, and organized every legal document Charles insisted should always remain updated. Charles trusted very few people completely. Richard was one of them. Even so, I never called. I convinced myself my husband would recover enough to finish whatever he had been trying to say. Instead, I received a call before dawn telling me to come to the hospital immediately. By the time I arrived, the room had become impossibly quiet. The nurses spoke with kindness. The doctor offered gentle condolences. Vanessa stood near the window with tears in her eyes, accepting sympathy from everyone who entered. I stood beside Charles, held his hand one last time, and silently wished I had understood what he had been trying to tell me only days earlier. As I parked outside Richard Bennett's office after the funeral, those final words echoed once again inside my mind. Richard knows. I did not yet understand what they meant, but I had the unmistakable feeling that my husband had left behind more than unanswered questions. The conference room overlooked the town square where Charles and I had once attended summer festivals, holiday parades, and charity auctions. Today the windows reflected only a room filled with quiet expectations. Richard Bennett welcomed everyone with the same calm professionalism he had carried for decades. He invited us to sit wherever we wished. Vanessa chose the chair closest to him without hesitation, crossing one leg over the other with the confidence of someone already imagining a different future. She greeted Charles's former business partners as though she intended to continue representing his legacy. Several of them smiled politely, uncertain how to respond. I quietly selected a seat near the end of the polished walnut table. It was where I had always been most comfortable during Charles's business meetings. I never needed to be the loudest voice in the room. Charles often told me that listening carefully revealed more than speaking ever could. As people settled into their chairs, I noticed familiar faces wearing expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity. Charles's accountant sat with a folder resting on his lap. His longtime office manager avoided eye contact entirely. Two distant cousins whispered softly before falling silent the moment Richard entered carrying a thick leather portfolio. He placed it carefully on the table, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked around the room with deliberate patience. "Before we begin," he said, "I want everyone to understand that Mr. Brooks left very detailed instructions regarding today's meeting. He asked that every document be presented in the exact order he specified." Vanessa smiled confidently. "Charles always liked being organized," she replied with a small laugh. Richard acknowledged her comment with a polite nod, but offered nothing more. The silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than anyone expected. I folded my hands together and remembered another afternoon almost 20 years earlier when Charles and I had signed our first estate plan in this very office. After the meeting, he had squeezed my shoulder and said, "If anything ever happens to me, Richard will make certain my wishes are honored exactly as I intended." At the time, those words had sounded comforting. Now they returned with unexpected weight. Vanessa leaned forward. I think Charles would have wanted to keep this simple, she said. Everyone has already been through enough emotionally. Her voice was gentle, almost caring, yet something about the timing felt carefully calculated. Richard met her eyes with the same steady expression he had maintained since the funeral. Mr. Brooks anticipated that today would be emotionally difficult, he answered. That is precisely why he left written instructions instead of relying on assumptions. The room became perfectly still. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner seemed louder. Richard finally opened the leather portfolio and removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Across the front, written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words. To be opened first. A quiet murmur spread across the table. Vanessa's confident smile faded for only an instant before returning again. She folded her arms and leaned back, clearly believing whatever was inside could not possibly change the outcome she expected. I stared at Charles's handwriting, realizing it was the first time I had seen it since his illness had weakened his hands. Memories of birthday cards, grocery lists, anniversary notes, and little reminders left beside the coffee maker came rushing back all at once. Richard carefully broke the seal, but paused before unfolding the pages inside. He looked directly at every person seated around the table. Ladies and gentlemen, he said quietly, Mr. Brooks instructed me to make one thing absolutely clear before I continue. He believed appearances during his final months were often misleading. He asked that no one interrupt until every document has been presented in full. No one spoke. No one moved. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier slowly gave way to uncertainty as Richard lifted the first page and prepared to read the very first words Charles Brooks had chosen to leave behind. Richard unfolded the first page with extraordinary care, as though every crease carried its own weight. Nobody shifted in their seat. Nobody reached for a phone. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper. This document, Richard began, is not my client's last will. It is a personal statement he instructed me to read before any financial matters are discussed. Vanessa let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Charles always enjoyed being dramatic, she said. Richard did not acknowledge the remark. Instead, he continued reading in Charles's familiar voice, a voice I could almost hear inside my own memory. If you are listening to these words, then my family has already gathered after my funeral. Some of you will be grieving. Some of you may already be thinking about what comes next. Before anyone hears how I distributed my estate, I want everyone to understand why certain decisions were made during the final months of my life. My heart tightened. Charles had never been someone who spoke emotionally in public. He preferred handwritten notes left beside the coffee maker or quiet conversations during evening walks. Hearing those carefully chosen words now felt strangely personal, even though the entire room was listening. Richard continued, My illness forced me to depend on other people more than I ever imagined. Dependence changes relationships. It reveals character. Sometimes it reveals kindness. Sometimes it reveals ambition. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Vanessa remained perfectly composed, but I noticed that her fingers, resting on the polished table, had stopped moving. Richard turned to the next page. During my final months, I intentionally allowed certain assumptions to continue because I needed to learn who truly respected my wishes and who merely believed they understood them. A low murmur spread across the room before disappearing just as quickly. Even Charles's accountant looked surprised. I remembered those final months differently now. The unexpected meetings. The conversations Charles insisted should happen without me present. The evenings when he appeared distant, followed by mornings when he quietly apologized without explaining why. At the time, I believed his illness was clouding his judgment. Now I wondered whether he had been carrying a burden he could not yet share. Vanessa finally leaned forward. I do not understand why this is relevant, she said with polite restraint. Surely Charles intended everyone to move forward today. Richard calmly folded his hands. Mr. Brooks specifically instructed that there be no interruptions until I reached the designated stopping point. His tone remained respectful, yet it carried the quiet certainty of someone following instructions exactly as written. Vanessa leaned back again, although the confidence she displayed at the cemetery had begun to soften around the edges. Richard resumed reading. If you believed silence meant ignorance, you misunderstood me. If you believed kindness meant weakness, you misunderstood Eleanor. And if you believed appearances reflected the complete truth, then today's meeting may surprise you. My name echoed through the room. I lowered my eyes instinctively, uncertain whether to feel comfort or sorrow. Charles had not defended me during those painful final months. At least, not in any way I had recognized. Yet here, in words prepared before his passing, he had spoken with remarkable clarity. Across the table, several of Charles's former colleagues glanced toward me with expressions that seemed almost apologetic. Richard carefully placed the final page of the statement beside the envelope. "Mr. Brooks instructed me to pause here," he said. He also instructed me to present one specific item before opening the formal will. From inside the leather portfolio, he removed a small brass key attached to a plain white tag. On the tag, written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting, were only 3 words. "Private deposit box." Richard looked directly at me before speaking. "Mrs. Brooks, your husband instructed that this key be placed in your hands personally before any beneficiary learns the contents of his estate." The room, already silent, became absolutely motionless as Richard extended the key across the polished table toward me. My fingers closed around the small brass key, and for a moment I forgot everyone else in the room. It felt surprisingly heavy for something so ordinary, as though Charles had somehow placed months of unanswered questions inside that single piece of metal. I turned it over slowly and recognized a tiny engraving from the local bank where we had kept our first savings account after we were married. Back then we could barely afford groceries some weeks, but Charles insisted that every family needed a plan for tomorrow, no matter how small today's paycheck might be. I looked up at Richard, hoping he would explain immediately, but he remained faithful to the instructions Charles had left behind. "There is more," he said quietly. "Mr. Brooks asked that the formal reading continue before anyone visits the deposit box." Vanessa released a slow breath and offered a confident smile that looked just a little less natural than before. "A key does not change anything," she said, folding her arms. Charles already made his intentions clear during his final months. No one answered her. Even those who had nodded politely to her at the funeral now seemed reluctant to speak. Richard opened another sealed folder and carefully removed several typed pages. "The following document is the official will executed 4 months before Mr. Brooks passed away," he announced. Vanessa straightened immediately, her confidence returning as if she had finally reached the moment she had been expecting all day. Richard began reading routine provisions first. Funeral expenses. Charitable donations to the local Children's Literacy Foundation that Charles had quietly supported for years. A scholarship fund for students entering construction management programs. Every paragraph reflected the thoughtful man I had known for decades. Then Richard reached the section concerning personal property. Charles had left several keepsakes to lifelong friends. His grandfather's pocket watch would go to his oldest nephew. His collection of woodworking tools would be donated to the vocational school where he had once volunteered. Nothing seemed unusual, yet I noticed Richard was reading unusually slowly, carefully emphasizing every sentence exactly as written. Vanessa glanced around the room with growing impatience. She tapped one perfectly manicured finger against the table before finally asking, "Can we move to the estate distribution?" Richard calmly looked back at the document. "We will proceed in the order directed by Mr. Brooks." His voice remained courteous, but there was no room for negotiation. He continued reading. The family lake cabin, which Charles had inherited from his parents, would remain in a preservation trust for future generations rather than being sold. His classic pickup truck would be restored and donated to the local historical museum. I remembered countless weekends spent driving that truck along quiet country roads, windows rolled down, listening to old country songs while Charles talked about retirement. Those dreams had disappeared long before his illness, replaced by appointments, medications, and uncertainty. Richard turned another page. The atmosphere inside the conference room had changed completely. At the beginning, everyone had expected a straightforward legal meeting. Now, every sentence seemed to carry hidden meaning. Every pause invited another question. Every document suggested there might still be something none of us understood. Vanessa no longer looked relaxed. She shifted slightly in her chair and asked for a glass of water. Richard paused only long enough for his assistant to place one beside her before continuing. Finally, He reached the end of the first will. He closed the folder gently and folded his hands. That concludes the original estate document executed 4 months before Mr. Brooks passed away. Vanessa smiled again, although it appeared forced this time. Then I suppose we are ready for the final distributions. Richard looked directly at her for several quiet seconds before reaching into the leather portfolio once more. This time he removed a second envelope, noticeably thicker than the first, bearing a different handwritten instruction across the front in Charles's unmistakable script. The room became silent as Richard read the words aloud. To be opened only after the first will has been read completely, because everything changes here. Richard held the second envelope for several quiet moments before breaking the seal with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the afternoon. No one spoke. Even Vanessa seemed to understand that whatever came next had not been part of the future she had imagined. Richard unfolded several pages and looked around the conference room before beginning. This document is a legally executed amendment signed 3 days before Mr. Brooks passed away, he said. It replaces any conflicting provisions contained in the previous estate plan. Vanessa immediately straightened in her chair. 3 days before? She asked, unable to hide her surprise. Richard acknowledged the question with a simple nod. The amendment was witnessed and notarized in accordance with state law. He resumed reading without another pause. Charles's words sounded calm, thoughtful, and unmistakably his own. If this amendment is being read, it means I reached conclusions during my final days that I could not ignore. Illness gave me many hours to observe people more carefully than I ever had before. I learned that kindness often speaks quietly, while ambition rarely remains patient. My eyes remained fixed on the tabletop. I could almost picture Charles sitting in Richard's office, choosing every sentence with care. He had always believed words carried consequences. He never wasted them. Richard continued. For months, I believed I understood the intentions of everyone around me. I was mistaken. Before making this amendment, I requested independent reviews of my financial records, personal correspondence, and business transactions. I wanted facts rather than assumptions. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the room. Charles's accountant slowly removed his glasses and stared toward Richard with visible curiosity. 2 of Charles's longtime business associates exchanged puzzled looks. Vanessa remained motionless, although the confidence she had displayed since the funeral had begun to disappear. Richard reached another page. The reviews uncovered information that required immediate changes to my estate planning. Because several matters involve private financial documentation, complete details have been secured separately. He paused briefly before looking directly at me. The location of those records is known only to Richard Bennett and identified inside my private deposit box. My hand instinctively closed around the small brass key resting beside my notebook. Suddenly, its importance became much clearer. It had never represented money alone. It represented answers. Vanessa finally spoke again, this time more carefully than before. What exactly is in those records? Richard folded one page before answering. Mr. Brooks instructed that the contents remain confidential until the deposit box is opened by Mrs. Brooks in my presence. His response was calm, professional, and completely final. Vanessa opened her mouth as though preparing another objection, but decided against it. Richard resumed reading. Effective immediately, several gifts listed in my previous will are withdrawn and replaced by the provisions contained in this amendment. My decisions should not be interpreted as acts of anger. They reflect my responsibility to protect what Eleanor and I spent a lifetime building together. Hearing those words stirred memories I had tried not to revisit. Our first tiny apartment with mismatched furniture. Weekend painting jobs that allowed us to save enough for a down payment on our first home. Long evenings balancing checkbooks at the kitchen table while dreaming about a future that always seemed just beyond our reach. None of those memories belonged to one person alone. They belonged to both of us. Richard carefully turned to the next page. Before I authorize distribution of any remaining assets, one final item must be reviewed. Its contents explain why this amendment became necessary. He reached into the leather portfolio again and removed a slim flash drive sealed inside a transparent evidence envelope bearing Charles's signature across the seal. Richard placed it gently on the conference table. Every pair of eyes followed the small envelope. Mr. Brooks instructed that this recording be viewed immediately before the final provisions of his estate are read, Richard said quietly. He believed that after seeing it, no reasonable person would question the decisions contained in his last amendment. Richard connected the small flash drive to the conference room television without saying a word. The screen remained black for a moment before Charles appeared sitting in a familiar leather chair inside Richard Bennett's office. He looked thinner than any of us remembered, yet his eyes were steady and his voice carried the same calm confidence that had guided our family for decades. He looked directly into the camera and offered a faint smile. If you are watching this recording, then I was not able to explain everything before I passed away. I owe several people an apology, especially my wife, Eleanor. My breath caught in my throat. Hearing my name spoken in his voice after the funeral felt almost unreal. Charles continued. Illness clouded my judgment at times, but it also forced me to pay closer attention. During my treatment, I asked Richard to quietly arrange independent reviews of my financial records because I noticed transactions that I could not explain. I did not accuse anyone. I wanted facts before making decisions. The room remained perfectly silent. Charles paused to collect his thoughts before continuing. The reviews showed that several people around me were offering advice based on their own interests instead of mine. Some encouraged expensive purchases that I never approved. Others attempted to influence business decisions while presenting themselves as trusted advisors. None of those actions reflected the values upon which Eleanor and I built our lives together. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but said nothing. Charles continued speaking with remarkable composure. I also realized that the person who remained consistently loyal never asked me for anything. Eleanor never asked for more money, more property, or more authority. She asked only whether I was comfortable and whether I needed anything. I should have recognized that difference much sooner. I lowered my eyes, unable to stop the tears forming despite every effort to remain composed. The apology I had waited months to hear arrived after it could no longer change our final conversations, yet it still carried healing I had not expected. Charles looked down briefly before returning his attention to the camera. If anyone believes silence means weakness, they have misunderstood my wife completely. Eleanor has carried our family through difficult years without asking for recognition. She deserves honesty, respect, and security after I am gone. Richard quietly folded his hands while everyone continued watching the screen. Charles resumed. The financial reviews, correspondence, and supporting records mentioned in my amendment have been secured separately inside my private deposit box together with written explanations for every significant decision. Those materials are intended to answer questions, not create conflict. I ask everyone to remember that truth does not need anger to stand on its own. Those final words settled over the room with extraordinary weight. Charles had chosen restraint instead of accusation, facts instead of emotional confrontation. Even those who had seemed skeptical earlier now appeared thoughtful. Charles offered one final smile. Richard, if you have reached this point, then thank you for keeping your promise. Eleanor, if you are listening, I hope one day you remember our happiest years more clearly than our hardest ones. I loved you long before success arrived, and I loved you until my final breath, even when I failed to show it as well as I should have. Please forgive my mistakes if you can. The recording ended, leaving only the reflection of everyone seated around the conference table staring back from the dark screen. No one spoke for several long seconds. Vanessa looked toward Richard as though expecting him to dismiss the recording as merely sentimental, but he calmly reached for the remaining pages inside the second envelope instead. Mr. Brooks instructed that the final distribution of his estate be read only after everyone had viewed his statement, Richard said quietly. According to his written instructions, we now proceed to the concluding provisions of the amended will. Richard adjusted the final pages of the amended will before looking around the conference room one last time. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet sense of purpose in every movement. The remaining provisions of Mr. Brooks's estate are now effective, he said. These instructions supersede all previous distributions where applicable. Vanessa folded her hands tightly together. The confidence that had surrounded her since the funeral had disappeared completely. She no longer smiled. She no longer looked toward anyone else in the room for reassurance. Richard continued reading in a clear, measured voice. The Brooks family residence, together with all furnishings, adjoining land, and maintenance trust established for its preservation, is transferred solely to my wife, Eleanor Brooks. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. It was never about the house itself. It was about hearing Charles acknowledge that the home we had built together remained exactly that, ours. Richard continued without interruption. The ownership interests in Brooks Custom Builders shall be transferred into a family trust administered by Eleanor Brooks with the assistance of independent financial advisors selected by Richard Bennett. Several of Charles's longtime business associates exchanged relieved glances. They had worked beside both of us for decades and understood how much the company represented far more than financial success. It represented generations of effort, employees who had become friends, and promises made to customers throughout the community. Richard turned another page. Any personal gifts, financial benefits, consulting arrangements, or discretionary allowances previously discussed but not formally included within this amended estate plan shall not be considered enforceable. Vanessa looked up immediately. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. Richard answered with the same professional composure he had maintained all afternoon. "It means only the written provisions contained in the executed documents have legal effect." The room became silent once again. Richard continued reading. "Should any individual attempt to challenge this amended estate without clear legal grounds, that individual shall forfeit any remaining discretionary benefit that might otherwise have been available under earlier documents." Charles had always believed that clarity prevented conflict. Listening to those words, I realized he had spent his final days trying to spare everyone years of unnecessary disputes. Richard reached the final page. "Mr. Brooks also instructed me to remind everyone present that generosity is never an obligation. It is a choice. Every decision contained within these documents reflects careful consideration made after independent professional advice." He slowly closed the folder. No dramatic announcement followed. No raised voices interrupted the quiet room. Only the unmistakable reality that Charles had spoken one final time through carefully prepared documents. Vanessa remained seated for several long moments before finally standing. She looked toward me, then toward the television screen that had only minutes earlier shown Charles asking for my forgiveness. Whatever she had expected from this day had disappeared completely. She opened her mouth as though preparing another argument, but quietly closed it again. Without another word, she gathered her handbag and walked toward the conference room door. No one tried to stop her. No one followed. After the door closed softly behind her, the room seemed unexpectedly peaceful. Charles's accountant offered me a respectful nod. One of his oldest business partners quietly said, "He wanted to make sure the right person protected everything the two of you built." I simply thanked him. There was nothing more to say. Richard waited until everyone else had gathered their belongings before placing the small brass key gently beside my hand once again. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "there is still one final step. Mr. Brooks specifically instructed that we visit the deposit box together before the end of today. According to his written instructions, what remains inside is intended only for you." Although he believed it would answer every remaining question that could not be explained during this meeting. I looked at the key resting quietly on the polished walnut table. Hours earlier, it had seemed like an ordinary piece of brass. Now it represented the final conversation Charles and I had never been able to finish while he was still alive. Richard and I left the office just before sunset. The streets were quiet, and the town seemed strangely unchanged, as though the longest day of my life had unfolded without anyone else noticing. We drove separately to the small brick bank where Charles and I had opened our very first account as newlyweds. The same bronze clock still hung above the entrance. The same marble floors reflected the afternoon light. Time had moved forward, yet this place somehow remained untouched. After signing the necessary documents, a bank manager escorted us into the secure vault. She unlocked a narrow metal drawer and stepped back respectfully. "Take all the time you need," she said before quietly leaving the room. Richard stood a few feet away, honoring Charles's request to give me privacy unless I asked for help. I placed the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside the deposit box rested a thick envelope, a small leather journal, several neatly organized folders, and a faded photograph of Charles and me standing beside the unfinished frame of our first home. We were both smiling, covered with sawdust, wearing inexpensive work clothes, and looking happier than I had remembered. Tears filled my eyes before I even opened the envelope. Across the front, Charles had written, "For Eleanor, the woman who built every dream with me." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter inside. Charles's handwriting was steady despite the illness that had taken so much from him. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then Richard has honored every promise I asked him to keep. I know I left you carrying questions that should have been answered while I was still beside you. For that, I am deeply sorry. I allowed distractions, poor judgment, and my own pride to place distance between us during my final months. None of those mistakes erased the truth that our life together was the greatest blessing I was ever given." I paused to wipe away tears before continuing. "Everything inside this box belongs to you because I trust your judgment more than my own. The financial records explain every change I made. The journal tells you what I was thinking during the hardest weeks of my life. I hope reading it helps you understand that I finally saw clearly what truly mattered." I gently opened the leather journal. It was filled with short daily entries describing ordinary moments I thought Charles had forgotten. One page mentioned the apple pie I baked every Thanksgiving. Another described how I still hummed while watering the flowers on our front porch. Another simply read, "She still believes in me even when I struggle to believe in myself." I smiled through my tears. Those quiet observations meant more to me than any financial document ever could. Richard waited patiently until I finished reading before speaking. "There is one more instruction," he said softly. He handed me another sealed note. Charles had written only one sentence inside. "Live forward, not backward." I folded every letter carefully before placing them back into the envelope. As we left the bank, the evening sun cast a warm golden light across the sidewalk. For the first time since Charles became ill, I felt something other than grief. I felt peace. Weeks later, I honored the wishes we had built together over a lifetime. I continued supporting the scholarship fund in Charles's name. I welcomed the employees of Brooks Custom Builders to a company gathering and assured them the business would continue with the same honesty Charles had always valued. I restored our old front porch instead of selling the house because every board carried memories worth preserving. I never saw Vanessa again. I did not need revenge, harsh words, or public humiliation to move forward. The truth had already spoken with far greater strength than anger ever could. Sometimes people believe wealth is measured by bank accounts, titles, or property. Charles taught me one final lesson after he was gone. Real wealth is being remembered by the people whose lives you quietly made better. As I placed fresh flowers beside his photograph in our living room, I realized that the woman who had once whispered I was broke had misunderstood everything. My greatest inheritance had never been the house, the company, or the savings Charles left behind. It was knowing that after 43 years together, the last promise he kept was giving me back my dignity, my peace, and the confidence to begin the next chapter of my life with my head held high.